which his wife, my mother, produced, and they've been handed out. We have a full schedule, including music, just like it was played, that my father loved, and remembrances from family and friends. And so with no further ado, I would like us to begin with our first speaker, who is Jonathan Staley.
So yes, I'm John Staley. I'm currently a professor and the current chair in the Department of Molecular Genetics and Cell Biology, which is Wolf's ultimate department at the University of Chicago, where he spent his entire academic career. I didn't overlap with Wolf while he was active as faculty, but I did overlap with him during his retirement. And I want to speak to both that personal acquaintance and also to what his scientific life meant. When my wife and I first arrived in Hyde Park 25 years ago, Wolf and Edna actually invited us over for dinner, and it was a really lovely event and one of those gestures you just don't easily forget. I've since learned that they've extended this hospitality to many newcomers, taking people in, helping them feel at home, and even befriending them. In the years that followed, I came to know Wolf in a different way as he pursued his research and retirement on the 8th floor of Cummings Life Science Center. During pauses in his experiments, he would hold court in our break room with whoever would listen, students, postdocs, faculty, it didn't matter. He'd pull you in, ask what you were thinking about, tell you what he was thinking about, and he proved to be funny, curious, and mischievous, as I'm sure many of you know he is. He worked on the 8th floor of Cummings until he was 84, riding his bicycle in, regardless of the weather. I love to ride my own bicycle, and I certainly hope that I'm still riding when I'm 84. Wolf officially retired in 1995 at age 65, and importantly by his own choice and for a specific reason. He wanted to free up his position in laboratory for younger faculty. I was hired 5 years later, and I am in a real sense a direct beneficiary of that decision, and I'm grateful to Wolf for his selflessness. It was really an extraordinary act, especially in academia, to step back from at the height of one's career so others can step forward. And then he kept coming back into lab anyway, despite his retirement, for 20 years, because the work, the research, the science still mattered to him. As a full-time academic, Wolf was a pioneer. He arrived at UChicago as a new faculty member in 1967, just as molecular genetics was being born. And he planted himself at that frontier, investigating how nutrients are transported into cells, a wide open area at the time. In particular, he investigated how bacteria take up and regulate potassium, the major cation in all living cells, essential for nearly every aspect of cell physiology, such as nerve function. He investigated potassium channels from every angle, biochemical, physiological, and especially genetic, and used the tools of bacterial genetics when those tools were still being invented. He characterized multiple potassium transport systems in bacteria, and including a high-affinity ATP-driven pump exquisitely tuned to the cell's potassium status. Wolf became a world authority on these systems, a reputation he earned over a lifetime of careful and rigorous work. And I want to highlight his last paper because it tells us something about who Wolf was. He published his last paper in 2016, 2 decades into his retirement. It concerned the molecular switch that ramps up potassium uptake when potassium in the cell is low. A prevailing model held that the switch responds to turgor pressure, the physical pressure that drops in the cell when potassium levels in the cell falls. Wolf's paper argued carefully and systematically that this model was wrong. Instead, the switch senses the influx of alternative cations, such as sodium, that flood in the cell when potassium is low. When I read this paper, I admired and was convinced by the clarity of the argument. When I looked up the prior model being overturned, I was shocked to find it was his own model, first conceived over 30 years earlier, and what he worked on for many years since. So what Wolf did is he reconsidered a theory he had built, satisfied himself that it was mistaken, and then published a sole author paper saying so, all at the age of 84. Edna shared that he was proud of this paper, and I believe it. This respect for the truth, the willingness to hold oneself accountable is not easy. In a world where those qualities seem increasingly rare, Wolf serves as a model, not just as a scientist, but as a person. Lastly, Wolf was loyal to the university and dedicated to members of the community. For example, he served as the chair of the Committee on Genetics. And perhaps his greatest impact was on his trainees, and I think we'll hear next from one of them. Coincidentally, I'm friends with David Litwack, who is a prior University of Chicago undergrad who worked in Wolf's lab. And I know David is grateful to Wolf's kind and tolerant mentorship that he shared with David. David went on to get his PhD at MIT and had a distinguished career spanning academia, the FDA, and biotech. So Wolf lives on in his trainees. So in closing, on behalf of the Department of Molecular Genetics and Cell Biology and everyone on the 8th floor of Cummings who ate lunch with him, thank you, Wolf.
So my name is Lou Laimins. I'm currently the chair of Microbiology Immunology at Northwestern University. And I had the privilege of being a graduate student with Wolf back a long time ago in the early 80s. Wolf was a wonderful mentor, and I had a great time doing science in his laboratory. I had wonderful colleagues and had the freedom to do experiments in science. And I have to say, I was one of those people that was responsible for the Turger pressure model, which he, in fact, wrote me a couple years ago and in detail explained how it was, the data were correct, but the interpretation was wrong. Anyway, I tell my students that I had some of the best years of my life as a graduate student in Wolf's lab, and they're all aghast, but it was a terrific time. Not only was Wolf a wonderful mentor, I had a wonderful time with Edna and his family in their house in Kenwood, and we had many occasions to get together and had a really joyful experience. Wolf was a frugal scientist, and so we studied bacteria, and we used plates of agar where we grow individual colonies. And so you had to pick those colonies individually to grow them up and expand them. Well, we used toothpicks to pick these colonies. And you know, toothpicks aren't really that expensive. But Wolf being frugal, we must have autoclaved them 10 or 20 times so that we could save money from that. But he was a wonderful mentor. I enjoyed talking to him about potassium transport, even though it was 35 years ago. And he was someone that I will always cherish and feel a wonderful part of my life. I will miss him dearly.
Hi, my name's Ian Booth. I live in Aberdeen in Scotland, and it's my pleasure to speak to you today about Wolf's scientific legacy. While I'm talking, I'm going to show a few images of Wolf that are among my personal favorites, and they will be on the screen share that I'm just starting now. As you all know, Wolf was a unique and wonderful individual. That has already been testified by those who spoke before me. For me, he was a mentor, friend, advocate, and critic for over 50 years. I never stopped learning from him, And over the years, I gained so much from knowing him. Wolf never took himself too seriously. He could be goofy, he was erudite, he was playful and yet masterful. And he was an amazing person who I'm delighted to have had in my life. Thank you, Wolf, for sharing so much, and thank you to all the family for sharing him with us. Thank you, Edna, for allowing him to be who he was, truly extraordinary. Wolf is not with us physically, but spiritually, he will be here through the many people he influenced and inspired. Edna's biography has already referenced his work, but I want to go a bit further. Wolf's work across his life is and will remain pivotal in the understanding of potassium accumulation by cells, a phenomenon that is fundamental to life itself. I need to explain that briefly. All life is made up of cells, bags of proteins and DNA surrounded by a membrane. The first cells faced a significant problem, that they were evolving surrounded by sodium ions, which inhibit protein and DNA function. To evolve, the first cells needed to accumulate potassium ions, which are compatible with protein function, and to expel sodium. The solution to this problem fascinated Wolf throughout his scientific career. Wolf's research strategy was simple and elegant. The only cell-based tool then available was genetics, the creation and characterization of mutants. Wolf knew that the bacterium Escherichia coli could grow in medium with very low potassium, which meant that it had evolved efficient mechanisms to capture and retain the iron. But what were these systems? He painstakingly selected mutants that had unusually high requirements for potassium in the growth medium. He developed this strategy through multiple cycles of mutagenesis and selection, and created a whole family of strains containing different mutations affecting their relationship to potassium. Crucially, at this stage, he only knew that these strains had altered properties, but not the nature of the systems affected. He needed to build on this foothold. He advanced by recognizing that the mutants essentially described two separate and complementary systems for harvesting potassium from the environment. The first of these, KDP, was switched on only when potassium was scarce. Wolf deduced that the cell was able to detect loss of cell rigidity and to trigger the synthesis of the KDP genes that would correct this deficiency. His hypothesis regarding the mechanism of sensing potassium scarcity and the rigorous testing of this hypothesis formed the mainstay of his many years' work. In fact, when the end point was known, Wolf's initial mutant collection has been shown to affect 5 different transport systems that we now work together under different circumstances to regulate the potassium content of the cell. Wolf trained many talented scientists in his lab and advised many more. Wolf appreciated that our influence carries on through the succeeding generations. I can't name them all, but you'll have heard from Laimins earlier. He and David Rhodes established the core literature on potassium uptake in 10 papers published between 1977 and 1981. Through these papers, Wolf set the parameters for future research that has guided the work of subsequent generations of researchers. As Wolf completed the genetics phase of his original and influential work, the era of genome sequencing arrived. With this technological development, the mutant strains that Wolf created, and so generously distributed, accelerated the research of many other research groups. Indeed, my first research visit to Wolf's lab in the summer of '86 was to investigate some mutants that he did not have time to characterize completely. They have underpinned my research work ever since and led to the identification of yet more features of cell physiology. Research is a mix of inspiration and perspiration. Wolf spared many groups of work a lot of perspiration, and by sharing his ideas and knowledge, he inspired them. As a result, these teams have now demonstrated the universality of his vision for how cells accumulate and retain potassium ions. When I first met Wolf and Edna, I was naive and ill-formed. Their guidance over 50 years shaped me into living a more enlightened way. They have the happy knack of asking difficult questions in a non-prejudicial way. Wolf gave me the tools to build and enjoy a broader landscape. This was not just for me, but for my family, my research team, and others who moved into his orbit. Wolf opened up our life and that of many others in an extraordinary range of ways. We first met in 1983, but in 1986 he welcomed me, my wife Nuala, and our children into his home in Chicago, and we became regular visitors to both lab and home after that. This was an introduction to his scientific life, but also to a shared culture. The concerts, shows, art galleries, and restaurants that he and Edna shared with us are too many to list. Safe to say, we shared a great many wonderful evenings across the States and in Europe. Together, the four of us had such wonderful discussions, ranging far away from scientific research. Wolf's range of interests, his depth of reading and analysis, was a constant source of inspiration. He was always ready to add to a discussion, but chose not to dominate or deflect. At the same time, he never let anyone engage in sloppy thinking and would often lower the heat with a goofy comment. He supplied genuine and deep friendship in abundance, and that is the greatest lesson that he gave me. Science is fine, but friends and family are more important. So there we have it. So much life, so many memorable moments. I am genuinely grateful to be able to count Wolf and Edna as my friends. Thank you.
Dear Edna, dear Epstein family, dear friends and former colleagues of Wolf. For those who don't know me, and let me briefly introduce myself. My name is Urs Schmitt-Ot. I came to the United States from Germany in autumn of 2002 to join the faculty in the Department of Organismal Biology and Anatomy at the University of Chicago. For a number of reasons, I set up my lab on the ninth floor in the Cummings building in what was then yet to be populated, newly renovated lab space in the Department of Molecular Genetics and Cell Biology. Let me give you a little bit of context of how I met Wolf. I was new to the country, new to the city of Chicago, and new to the world of American academia, and new to what I now like to call our wonderful University of Chicago. But back then, I knew very little about this place, its tradition, its academic culture. As an undergraduate in Brussels, in Belgium, I had been impressed by Enrico Fermi's small volume Thermodynamics, but I did not register that Fermi had taught at the University of Chicago. Later, as a transfer undergraduate to the student to the University of Freiburg in Germany, I had learned about Tony Marwal's classic genetic experiments in fruit flies. But again, I didn't know he too had been teaching at the University of Chicago until I met him on the 9th floor in the Cummings building, where Chip Ferguson had given him an emeritus bench in his lab, and where he continued to pursue research, mingling with us and our students. But during the first weeks on the 9th floor in Cummings, I must have been alone. Only this can explain why I tried my office key on neighboring office doors in desperate search of file rails for the cabinets in my office. I can reassure you that for the most, my key did not work on these other doors, but there was one exception. And yes, plenty of file rails there for me to steal. A week or so later, a rather small, very energetic man with dense white hair showed up on the 9th floor and moved into that very office. He didn't seem to be bothered by the lack of file rails in his cabinets, and had his papers spread out all over the place and appeared incredibly busy. Of course, we introduced each other. It turned out that he had officially retired, but was preparing a class on foundational papers in genetics. Given his busy activity, you may understand in what state he was when one day he had locked himself out, keys inside his office. Well, you already know that I was able to help. It didn't seem to bother him the least that I had a key to his office door. Instead, he soon began inviting me to his house, starting off a long tradition, fostered by Edna's pleasure to host all kinds of people and her considerable cooking skills. To my knowledge, Wolf was only good at making tarts. Edna's cooking skills had the probably unintended effect that I only rarely dared to reciprocate. It seemed so much nicer to come to her and Wolf's house, fostered also by a long string of friends and family members of Wolf and Edna that I met and enjoyed over the years at the Epstein's dinner table. And fostered by at times vigorous discussions. On such occasions, it could happen that Wolf, certainly out of concern for the guests, would admonish his wife from the opposite end of the table. "Edna, you are not on stage." Yes, he was an anchor. To you, Edna, but not only to you. Let me come back to this in a minute. Sometimes Wolf and Edna would take me along to watch a concert or play. Afterwards, if it was not too late, they would take me out for dinner at a place like Chinatown's Triple Crown. The fanciest restaurant visit of my life also goes on Wolf's account. That was on the occasion of his 87th birthday, when he took Edna and me out to a restaurant quite fittingly called Everest, a celebrated French restaurant located on the 40th floor of the Chicago Stock Exchange building. When I thanked Wolf the following day for the fanciest restaurant experience of my life, he wrote back, "It was one of the fanciest meals I ever had, too." Wolf was unassuming. He cared about a nice meal and a good bottle of wine, but he trusted his own judgment and enjoyed his cheap bottles just as much, as long as he thought it was good. For restaurants, the same. That fancy Everest experience, he may have chosen to thank his wife. He also may have thought, if not now, when? Good company, a good discussion were important. And this was most readily achieved at home. Wolf and Edna were very good hosts. My kids felt it too. And they liked to come, whether in Chicago or at the Epstein's family shack, Wolf's term for their beautiful cottage on Lake Tomahawk in Wisconsin. Here is a little anecdote to illustrate both points, Edna and Wolf's art of hosting and my kids' responsiveness to it. It was in summer 2024. Two of my kids, by then young adults, had come over from Germany to canoe down the Colorado River. They had an amazing experience and decided upon their return to Chicago to take me on another, in their eyes, for me, more appropriate camping trip. So we went to Michigan, where there are beautiful campsites hidden in the dunes on the shores of Lake Michigan. That was not too far from where a vintage ferry, the SS Badger, crosses Lake Michigan to Wisconsin. So I casually brought up that we could take that ferry and visit the Epsteins at their cottage, which they already knew from previous trips. That sounded like a cool thing to do to them, and so I called Edna, telling her that we could be there the same evening, though it might get a little late. "Doesn't matter, I go to bed late," she said. "Not so late," I said. How late are you planning to come?" I hesitated. 3 a.m.? "Okay," she said. "I'll leave the door open, just find your way to your bedroom." So we came. Not without crashing into a pile of urgently needed gutters at the place where I was trying to park the car, but at least we didn't wake up Edna or her more respectable guest who had arrived ahead of us the previous day. I'm so glad we came. For my kids, it was the last time they saw Wolf, already ailing, but welcoming them with joy, I believe, nevertheless. When they were younger, Wolf had managed to reactivate an essentially decommissioned sailboat for them, and they had other fond memories of him and Edna. This time, the discussions with Wolf were already reduced, but Edna made up for it and drew our attention with stories and even a little film on her family's arrival on Ellis Island shortly after the end of World War II. The last time I saw Wolf was on his 94th birthday in 2025. The family had gathered. Clearly, it was a special moment. Edna had asked if I wanted to join them for dessert. What an honor, Edna. Wolf was still up and sitting at one end of the table, listening patiently and perhaps happily to the lively discussion, though he would no longer participate. Wolf, I wish you a very good night, was the last I said to him while we had to stop him from getting up for that. When I think back about Wolf, two thoughts dominate. Firstly, Wolf felt very familiar to me right away. What was it that made me so readily connect with him? Wolf and Edna's extensive effort in developing and cultivating social fabric at the University of Chicago and beyond certainly helped, but that doesn't explain what I felt for Wolf. Was it irrespective of our very different family histories, cultural roots, and family style? I don't really know. I never met Wolf's parents. Sometimes I think it was his empathy combined with a slight embarrassment to show it. My late father, born the same year than Wolf, certainly also had that side. But for both, the term sounds a bit too fashionable. The second thought, when thinking back about Wolf, is that he treated me not so much like the colleague, friend, mid-aged father of three that I was, but more like a foster child, though not always a perfect one. "You're fired," he would say when it was time for me to leave. But he stopped using that expression when its connotations had changed. My early years in Chicago were difficult, both privately and professionally. Wolf must have noticed that, and he made a large difference in my life during those years. We rarely talked about science, although he was still conducting experiments at his Emeritus bench in the lab of Lucia Rothman-Danis when we first met. However, Wolf, and Edna, I should say, played a big role in making me arrive in the United States. You were both an anchor to me and the first on this shore. Only rarely was I able to give you back. So I'm glad to be given today the opportunity to say thank you to Wolf, to you, Edna, and to your family, whom I feel to know better than they know me, although I could be wrong on that. I miss Wolf, and I hope our friendship continues into the next generation. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. All right, we got a lot of people up in here. I was making sure everybody can go with Wolf. My name is Markell Osler. I am Edna's trainer. I think Edna and I, we've been training since 2007. Man, I feel like being here today and seeing kind of like the totality, a greater picture of your world and you and Wolf's world is like I've read, Edna has told me excerpts of the stories of family, you know, her children, grandchildren, associates, and different people. And I've had the pleasure of getting a perspective that, probably is a little bit more intimate because I see Edna trains with me 3 days a week for the last, I don't know, 10 years. And so when I met Edna, I met her through another friend who she used to come to the gym. And the first time I met Edna, I heard her before I actually saw her. And you guys get the idea, it was around the time that Obama was going into office. And so she was definitely pro-Obama, and everyone along the hallway had to be pro-Obama. As we started to train, there were some things that stuck out about Edna that I knew that relationship would be very different. Number one is that we all have personalities as individuals, but when you work out and you're in the gym environment, you also take on a gym personality. Everybody, if you work out casually, even if you only go once a week, if you take a walk, the personality that you take on when you're exercising is slightly altered from that of your day-to-day. And Edna's definitely, I would say, for me, Edna's definitely very smart, driven, sure of herself. And what would be the last thing I'd say? Edna is I'm going somewhere with that. Dogmatically herself. Okay, so I trained her for a few years, and then one day, Wolf walks in. She walks in, they walk in, actually Wolf walked in before her. So I said, "Can I help you?" He said, "No." And so I thought, well, who is this man? Like, and what is he doing in the gym? And she comes in and she's like, "Wolfie-sa, you gotta wait for me." And so I thought, okay, we're gonna see where this goes. And I said, okay, well, is Wolf gonna train with us today? And he said no. And so every time they'd come, that went on for about easily a year. Wolf would come and he'd bring his book. He'd sit in the corner. Ed and I would train squats, lat pull downs, rows, tosses. We do all kinds of exercises. I'd go, "Wolf, you want to exercise?" "Nope." And she'd come in another day. "We got to convince him to exercise." We do all these different things. I'd say, "Wolf," I got more comfortable with him and say, "Hey, Wolf, would you be willing to do, at least 5 minutes, Wolf?" "Nope." So then it became personal. It went from Edna wanting to get Wolf into the game to me wanting to get Wolf into the game. So one day, I don't know what possessed him to do it. She was on him to actually work out. And he says, "Okay." And he actually we had a full workout. But what was surprising is that I learned personally, my background is, my degree is in kinesiology. So I work with, or exercise science. So I work with people of all backgrounds. But one of the things that the books cannot tell you is not to judge a book by its cover. And certainly when we worked out the first time, I didn't realize that I had done that. So we're doing this exercise where I toss it, and he's supposed to catch the ball and just basically toss it back, but the ball bounced off the floor, and it was going in one direction, and Wolf literally stuck his hand out to the side, and he caught it. Like, you have to understand, I'm a younger man thinking that he can't move this way. So literally, he's like Spider-Man, goes down and catches the ball, and I literally look at him like, I didn't know that man could move like that. So immediately, he looks at me, he goes, "Yep." And I said, it was very simple way of him saying, "I'm doing this because of my wife. But under no circumstances are you allowed to underestimate me." And so over time, that became the nature of our relationship. Edna would come, she trained. Most of the time, Wolf would just sit and read in the corner, and our relationship was that for some years. Well, our relationship matured, and Eventually, Edna asked me to come into their home. So I eventually started going to their building and training Edna there. We start off a few times a week. And finally, Wolf wanted to work. She says, Wolf's going to work out with us today. And I said, whoa, what's this about? Well, apparently, the one person who can get him to work out other than Edna had made the call, and Wolf was all in. And that person was, guess who? The doctor. Apparently, the doctor told him that he had to work out. And so the switch happened where instead of me coming in and watching Edna, Wolfie saw, come on, just that, there was literally a switch where he would be at the door, sitting in his chair, practically waiting for me. And the workouts totally changed into something that was poetic in a way. And that's what I really want to drive home, is that no matter how much time we spend with one another, you don't really know, we don't ever fully know one another. Because over time, the wolf that I knew in the beginning started to become someone else. He started to become someone who I was training to someone I was learning from. And if I can be very transparent, I started to anticipate the workout sessions, because it's a different thing to see somebody in these physiology books where they tell you when you're working with an older adult, you have to be careful because you want to make sure it's very technical, but they don't teach you that people, when you work with anyone, they're giving you something when you're servicing them. And the thing I started to pick up from Wolf is about leadership. And I didn't know that I was learning that. I did not know that I was learning how to be a better leader, how to be more present. I started to watch the dynamic of their relationship. Yes, Edna has a more outward, boisterous, aggressive, assertive way about herself, but in no way was Wolf the lack thereof it. There's a certain power that you have with knowing how to lead from behind, with not having to be loud, to get a message across with saying less. And I started to take that on because Wolf and I had a communication. And I'd say, Wolf, how you doing? He'd go, and the thumbs up. And then I'd say, Wolf, how you doing? He'd go. And then I'd say, Wolf, how are you doing? He'd go. He'd shake his head. And I knew that Wolf, we had our own communication. And so our relationship continued to mature. And it went from me just coming to train Edna and Wolf 2 to 3 times a week to let's go to lunch. I mean, all right. So Wolf, myself, Edna, and some of her helpers, we'd be off to lunch, and we were definitely an interesting looking group. And Wolf, in his own way, had a magnetic presence with people that we didn't know. People were obviously have a certain amount of deference when you're a certain age, but it wasn't just that. Wolf was adorable. Wolf was powerful. Wolf was charming. Wolf was adept. And I'd say the biggest thing that I got from Wolf is that power doesn't have to yell. Real power doesn't have to scream. You can say a thing without it being a thing. And our relationship matured, and it started to become a thing where I actually started to love Wolf. And if I'm being honest, I really love you, Edna, and you know that. But our relationship started to mature into something that I'd like to think that in the small amount of time that we spent together, that Wolf saw me too as a student, maybe not in the biology sense, but that he saw me as someone that was willing to know. So I want to leave everyone with this, is that we all have tons of stories that we can share about Wolf. And when Edna asked me to speak, I was kind of flabbergasted, like, you want me to say something? But the more I thought about it is, I got a chance to see Wolf in a different stage. I got to see Wolf in a different stage that was very intimate. His more vulnerable stages, the days he didn't want to train, but he'd look over at Edna and he wanted to be there for her. And as a matter of fact, they had a running joke about how long he wanted to stick around. And she said, Wolfie, so are you going to do it another year? Yep. And I started to say, wow, how powerful is it to keep our commitments? How powerful is it for us to keep our commitments, not to just ourselves? Because you know how we are with our own existence. But knowing how to stand with and for another individual is something that's completely unique. So I just want to thank everyone for being willing. I mean, even just a hello, just being able to share yourselves in this space. It means a great deal to have you all, and I know Edna stressed this a great deal, how grateful she is for the life that they've shared. And as the children, you know, I'm grateful for hearing the stories about you all. I literally feel like I've had a chance to watch a movie. As you all come in, it's like watching a movie where you see the characters and it's like, oh, there that person is. She was the one that, and it's like really interesting. And so I'm really grateful for the opportunity to know you, Wolf, wherever you are. I'm really grateful for you, Edna. I'm grateful for the family. And I want to end on this note. Less is more. Less is more. That's it.
Hello, everyone, and thank you all for being here to celebrate and reflect on the life of this extraordinary man, whom I am proud to call my grandfather, or simply, Opa. At a young age, my Opa struck quite a mysterious figure in my imagination. My friends would playfully tease me that Opa was a mad scientist, likening him to Albert Einstein's long-lost brother. And I'd be lying if there wasn't a time where I myself wondered if there was some distant familial connection, as he would walk with us down the streets of Hoboken with his shock of white hair exploding in every direction, his thick glasses, and his flowing trench coat. Perhaps unsurprisingly, I wasn't the only grandchild who initially viewed my grandfather this way. Speaking to my cousin Seth, he relayed that growing up, his favorite movie was Back to the Future, given the striking resemblance between Opa and Doc Brown. And of course, beyond merely looking the part, he just so happened to be an excellent scientist, one that has inspired 3 more of his grandchildren, including my sister, to follow in his footsteps and pursue the sciences. I hope they can explain to me Opa's work, because I surely still do not understand. But throughout it all, and as far back as I can remember, my grandfather always struck me as possessing an almost supernatural calmness, a trait, thankfully, that was infectious. He was kind, gentle, and humble, almost to a fault. But critically, he had an incredible sense of humor. As my cousin Izzy put it, his tranquility and humor, coupled with his bark of a laugh, was something that drew the family together. In preparing for today, I was trying to think of a story that captures Opa's essence and reflects just why myself and my generation of Epsteins so admire him. What ultimately came to mind is a simple enough story. Roughly 10 odd years ago, my sister and I visited my grandparents at the lake house in Wisconsin. As we pulled into the driveway, a rather strange and somewhat alarming picture unfurled before us. There, on the top of the roof of the cabin, stood Opa, shirtless, well over 80 years old. He waved down to us with work tools in hands and a broad smile on his face. My sister and I were not smiling. We instead demanded that he come down immediately and promised never to go back up there without us because, God forbid, he fall. Opa, of course, didn't see what the problem was. He had clearly been frequenting the roof for some time. But sensing our trepidation, and as ever the pragmatist, he offered a compromise. You see, unbeknownst to me, the wood ladder that he had used to scale the cabin's roof was roughly as old as he was, and was rotting to boot. So rather than agree to never go back up on the roof, he asked that we help him rebuild the ladder, so at least the act of climbing up and down would be marginally less dangerous. We reluctantly agreed. Now, I can't speak to the structural integrity of the rebuilt wood ladder. I certainly would not use it. But for the next few hours, as we sawed wood and hammered in nails, Opa, with a glass of wine in hand, supervised our work and shared stories from his youth. He talked about growing up in Wisconsin, meeting my grandmother, and even how he was in the wrong place at the wrong time and was arrested for his so-called panty raid while in medical school. It's small moments and stories like these that I'll cherish and hold with me as reminders of the man he was. And I speak for all of us grandchildren when I say we wish we had more time to spend with him. But we are all so grateful for the warm memories and hilarious stories we have of him from Chicago to the cabin and even to the Amalfi Coast. In short, his memory is a blessing we all carry with us. Thank you so much.
Right. So thank you all for being with us here today. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Laimins. Thank you, Ian, if you're listening along. Urs, Michael, Markell, for all your kind words and your contribution to this. It's very touching and means a huge amount to my entire family. And we're very grateful. I'm here to speak to you on behalf of both myself and my brothers, sort of to try and convey a little bit of what our father was like to us, his children. But, I think, as many of you know, our father was the master of both the short, pithy, perfectly judged speech and the long, rambling, slightly hard to follow story. I will endeavor to sort of emulate him in the first of those two talents, but please forgive me if occasionally I stray into the second. I do that also in his honor. It won't come as much of a surprise when I say I spent a long time thinking about what to say today, how to memorialize our father properly, how to describe someone who is in some ways so straightforward, so who he was, and in other ways just so unusual. And so I'll try my best. And one thing I think that becomes really clear as I was thinking about him, and as sort of today really, really proves, is he was the same person in every aspect of his life, right? He was the same man at work in his lab, with his friends, with our mother, with his children, with his grandchildren. He was always himself and his qualities. And I will say he was a man of quality. They showed themselves in different ways with different people, but he was just always him. He was curious, unbelievably decent, capable, mostly, intuitive, tolerant, impatient, very messy, a bit dreamy at times, but always with a kind of levity to everything he did. It's funny, when you're sort of planning these things, you come across quotes, and I came across a quote from a well-known scientist who was once asked to justify some of research and whether his research had practical implications. And the quote that he came back with was, "To tell you the truth, we don't do this because it's useful. We do it because it's amusing." And I thought, that could have been my father. Right? And I think that sort of gets to a little bit the heart of who he was and sort of the kind of father he was with us. I think everybody's heard today from my nephew, from others, that he really loved to tinker, right? He loved to fix things. It seemed to us as his children that there was nothing he couldn't fix or build. And if he told us don't bother, replace it. We knew that was really beyond repair. And he built and repaired so much of everything around us, everything. And I'm sure some of it was generational, but it also felt like a sort of good summary of his many qualities, his curiosity, his thriftiness, his decency on some level, not wasting things, making the world a little better when you found it, helping people, maintenance almost as a sort of kind of virtue that sort of animated him. But also I think always he found it kind of fun, kind of amusing. He brought that also to his sort of, everything he did. And in his gentle, very straightforward way, he taught us, his children, along the way to try and be a little bit the way he was. I mean, it's funny, I'd never heard the roof story from my nephew, but he did the exact same thing with my brothers, repeatedly. And in fact, literally, he would rope them into roof repair, and then he would tie a rope around their waists and tie them to the chimney of the roof as they sat there redoing the roof of the summer house that my parents took us to. But he taught them how to fell trees, mostly how to not take down power lines when you did it, but not entirely. How to strip wood off of old windows, how to handle an axe, how to cut down Christmas trees, build bookcases, redo brickwork, use a radial arm saw, and so much more. And always, he didn't lecture us, he would show us. He would show us how to build a ladder. And he was a good teacher, sort of teaching us along the way that we were sort of competent also, and skillful, and helpful, and that it could be fun, and it wasn't just work, and it was a sort of fun thing to do. And along the way, he also taught us to be curious, that it was never a wasted effort to take something apart, see if you could figure out how to get it working again. Maybe you could, maybe you couldn't, but it was worth it to make the effort and find out along the way. I have to tell one anecdote because it was just so funny. This sort of reached its apex. My middle brother had bought a car, and of course, having been well taught by our father, it needed some repairs. My brother thought, well, I should do that myself. The repairs required taking the engine out of the car. So Ezra hired a winch, winched the engine out, made the repair, all wonderful, and then found he couldn't quite get the motor back in. Unsurprisingly, it weighed, I don't even know how much, 300, 400, 500 pounds. So of course at that moment, after everything's gone very well, Ezra has to go in and get my father to help, which delighted him and amused him, and he thought it was great. So there he was with Ezra lying on the middle of 50th Street with some 70s car, the engine in the air. Somehow they got it back in. I don't really remember the details, but what I most remember is just how fun he thought it was and how he was like, this is great. Yes, this is what we do. So, and he was sort of always like that, sort of simple pleasures, summers in Wisconsin, as everyone has heard. Everyone came up with us. And it was a place where, our father built the bathroom with his brother there, built the woodshed with his brother in the summers. And, it was a place where it sort of felt like we lived a little bit the way he would have preferred everything to be. There was no TV. There was no running, there was no laundry. We all washed in the lake, hung our clothes, washed our clothes by hand and hung them up to dry in the woods. And there was just, sort of simple pleasures. It's where he taught us how to row a boat and how to kayak and how to build a fire. It's where he would dive for quartz in the lake with us, playing for hours, and read to us in the evenings. It was sort of very much my father and being a father with us. And my father really didn't care about things. I think most people know he was not exactly a very materialistic man, but he understood other people's sort of desire for things. And so, I think another good example is up at the summer house. Every other house, or a lot of the other houses, had these beautiful floating docks, and people bought them, and they were nice and very tasteful, and we really wanted one. So, of course, our father thought, well, we can build one. And he did. But this being our father, it was made out of bits of lumber, barrels I think he got from the dump, a metal chain, a bunch of cinder blocks, and they built this sort of Frankenstein of a floating dock that my brother would have to dive down and attach to its anchor 10 feet down in the water every summer and dive back down and detach it so we could bring it back to shore. But there it was. It was solid. It was very well built. It was fun. And our father had built it for us to make sure that we both knew we could do it ourselves and so we could have a little bit of fun. He was quirky, right? He had a strong preference for the practical over the pretty. He was famously, I think as everyone who knew him knows, indifferent to his appearance. He had a deep contempt for shoelaces, never tying them, never have understood that. I think he thought they were just absolutely a waste of anyone's time. He never finished things once he'd found them boring, leaving uninteresting projects everywhere. And he was very, very messy. You know, his thriftiness was also married to his complete lack of desire to put things away. So we grew up in a house with bricks and tools and cans of saved nails scattered around the kitchen. But, you know, that is also who he was. And needless to say, it was, you know, he produced fastidious children as a result, I will say. Maybe that was... We had to rebel some way. And, you know, he was also, I wouldn't say impatient, but not a man who liked to sit around, right? He would, at the lab, take the stairs both ways. He couldn't be bothered to wait for the elevator. He worked mostly on his feet as a lab bench. He would ride his bike so he could move at speed and in his own schedule, not waiting for other people. And I think it does remind me of another sort of, you know, and he didn't like to stand around. If we'd get to the airport, he'd be a little bit bored and go wander off. If we were waiting in line in the theater, he'd say, I'm just going to go over here, and then he would be gone. Always, you know, a little bit antsy, a little bit impatient. And it does, you know, remind me a little bit of a story his mother would tell. She would tell lots of stories of what a lovely, beautiful, adorable little child he was. But the one story she would sometimes tell with a little bit of a shudder almost is as they were waiting to get on the boat to leave Nazi Germany in the 30s. My father, very little, wandered off. Because you do. He came back, he didn't get lost, he knew exactly where he was, but, you know, even at that time, he never learned the lesson that maybe you shouldn't wander off when you're waiting for things. That was a sort of habit he kept for his whole life, and something we all mostly had to get used to. But you never had to go find him. He was always back in good order, you know, before we had to leave. And I suppose I shouldn't joke about it, but might not be able to resist, but any mention of him wandering off, which he did right up to the very end, we never knew if that was dementia or him still being himself, does bring me somewhat to his last years, where he very sadly did suffer from vascular dementia for 5-10 years. We're not really sure how long when it started. And it was something we never expected our athletic, lively, seemingly very healthy father would ever succumb to. But the funny thing is, even through a long and slow and very sad decline, he stayed the same person and stayed very much himself, curious, uncomplaining, making jokes, wandering off, sorry, not funny, thanking his carers, thanking our mother, letting her know how much he loved her, and tempering the sadness of it all, and it was very sad, with his pleasure and his amusement at what life still had to offer. And it was a wonderful thing to see even here at this stage of life. He was still the same person we've heard about today. And there was it was lovely. Sorry, that's not the most eloquent. And not long after he died, a friend asked a question about him, and it conjured up a very long forgotten memory of my father that I felt suddenly was very him. We were walking once in a parking lot. It was like a cold, icy February, and the ice was particularly smooth and slippery as we were walking back to the car from having bought something. My father just stopped inching, looked up, and started skating through the parking lot, happily gliding along in his large trench coat with his shock of hair carrying the shopping. And so I joined him, and we skated our way on the ice to the car. And I remember even at the time thinking he was sort of teaching me something really important that I should remember and pay attention to in the moment. Right? Replacing a humdrum, uneventful, kind of unpleasant walk to the car in a boring car park with a little bit of joy and a little bit of amusement. And it was, yeah. So before I finish, I think there is one more of his qualities that it feels important to speak to and that I've often tried to find words for and still can't quite describe the way I'd like to. And it may be the one thing people haven't spoken about as much today, which is our father fundamentally lacked those qualities that motivate so many of us. Pride, vanity, ego, even sometimes the desire to be perceived by other people in a certain way. He cared about other people. He was never indifferent to what other people felt or valued, but he didn't care whether other people admired him or not, and he was never motivated by striving for anyone else's regard. He managed always to be himself, unshaped by other people, and yet never indifferent to them. He was conscientious, considerate, accepting, and wholly himself, because he just was. And in that, I think he was truly rare and a wonderful example for his children, I hope his grandchildren. I hope these remarks have done him some justice, and I've described him well, or as well as you can in a few words. I could absolutely go on, but I won't. I've, of course, left out an awful lot, but I hope and think what we will all carry forward with us when we remember him are his qualities, his decency, his straightforwardness, his curiosity, his gentle bemusement, and his playfulness. I've never really met anyone like him, and we as children were lucky to have had him as a father and as an example. He always let it be known, I think, that he felt he'd had a good life, with plenty to amuse and delight him. And he always let us know how grateful he was for that. And so I think we can all be grateful that he had a life that was like that. Thank you.
Goodness. I do want to thank every one of you for being here. And I want to read something that I hope I can get through. It's an elegy for my beloved husband, Wolfgang Epstein. And see, I'm not even sure I can start it. I adored you, but I didn't know I did. Who can live in perpetual adoration? So I didn't. Instead, we didn't tug at one another. Instead, we leaned toward one another. Instead, there was no diminishment. Instead, there was gaiety and laughter. Instead, there was space. There was comfort. There was peace. You would speak. I was just thinking of the very same thing, I'd say. You'd answer. External sensations spark the same thoughts. There is no such thing as mental telepathy. Well then, two radios tuned into the very same frequency, I'd said. A quick look across a table of chattering 10. The other 8 saw, heard nothing. My glance asked, "You heard that too?" "Of course," your glance answered. "Then you understood it as I did?" "Of course." Only now that the other radio that was you is beyond reach, only now that your knowing glance no longer meets mine, only now that you are gone, I call what was by its rightful name.